Hi, Matt. I'm the CEO of PlaySpace. We build software for therapists that work with children and teens. Essentially, when the pandemic hit, people were forced to go on video to do therapy sessions, and therapists that work with kids didn't have all the tools they have in their playroom. And so we've been creating those, and we serve therapists to make care more accessible to their patients.
And when you were coming up with this idea, was it inspired due to COVID, or how did you come up with this? Because obviously now after COVID, virtual play space makes a lot of sense. But when the idea was being started, what was the inspiration or the ideation that got it to where it is today?
Yeah, so let me just say my therapy journey started over 20 years ago. I have a number of conditions like bipolar 2, borderline personality disorder, ADHD. And so for someone like me, mental health is managed, not cured. And I say that because when I first went into therapy, I crossed my arms, I wouldn't say anything. And then my therapist brought out arts, we started playing board games, and that's what allowed us to build rapport. And so, come COVID, I was actually working on the IPO of a digital mental health company that I was part of the founding team of. I'm in this space. I'm passionate about the cause, obviously, for personal reasons. And my therapist, that I've had a 20-year relationship, came to me and asked if there was anything out there that would allow her to give the same opportunity that I had when I was able to, go into the physical playroom, which now we no longer need because I've graduated to video as an adult myself. But for the kiddos, they need it, and so I truly came by it honestly in that sense.
And throughout like your early career, did you want to be an entrepreneur? Was this a plan of yours from day one, or did it kind of just happen to be once the idea and inspiration came? Or was this from like, in elementary school, selling candy bars out of the locker, mowing lawns? Or how did your journey of an entrepreneur begin? Or did you just kind of fall into this founder life to say so?
Yeah, so anyone that knows me, I think, would say that I've sort of been that mowing lawns type. My equivalent, I mean, I still to date have the nickname of Cakes because I had a business in high school called Maddie Cakes. And now I always tell people, careful, if you start a business in high school, that name can stick. But I baked cakes and I DJ'd, and that parlayed into a Parmesan wheel pasta business at food festivals and a I mean, there was thing after thing after thing, really. But it was then as I was in my career, I was working at a consultancy, working on some specific initiatives where we created theses. And one of them was around mental health. And that's where sort of my journey into the digital health space was started. And since then, I've really been more of an employee rather than the entrepreneur. And I've been enjoying that. But then when it came to me and there was nothing out there, I thought it needed to be solved and I have to solve it.
And when you were building the company, obviously with anything startup related, there's like that risk. Did you yourself feel it was risky to take on and try to start something? Or because you saw the need, did you feel that this was just a logical step to do?
What I'd say is, if I'm being 100% honest, that I probably had an overconfidence because I was coming off, I guess, what I would say would be my first career win.
Mhm.
And it was also in a time where money was uh, not as hard to come by, particularly in the digital health space. I started it right before that time, and fundraising and corporate development, I mean, that was something I really specialized in. So I think I was a bit naive about that coming into it, and I thought it'd be a bit easier, especially with the problem being so significant. But what's interesting is in that in healthcare, it's not about the merit of a problem. Every problem has merit. It's around the urgency, whether this actually not at scale is the right answer to scale, and things like that. And so, yeah, I probably entered it with a bit of a naivety, but I would do it again on the basis of its laurels.
And one thing you touched on was obviously there's a lot of confidence that comes with obviously starting a business because the classic thing is you have to be overconfident to do something that never has been done before. Because typically there is a reason, whether it be timing, market, but like life finds a way type thing. Over your journey, was there some things that you felt were easier than expected, and were there some things that were a lot harder than expected? Or because you're already in within that startup ecosystem, do you kind of know what to expect, at least for the first little bit?
Yeah, I mean, not that I'm painting myself in the best light here, but I think again, this would be the second of two things where I might have been a bit naive. In my last business, it was really I was hand in hand with the CEO of that business,
Mhm,
and when you're sitting in the passenger seat, it's just so much easier because you're kind of nipping at their heels and criticizing for optimization, which is why you're in that role. But
mhm,
then when you're in that position yourself and there isn't that parachute, so to speak, and there isn't that person that takes it on and you have that ownership mentality, those optimizations now are much less significant than some of the bigger pictures that now you become responsible for. So I think yeah, I think I was most surprised by how hard it was to do what I thought would be sort of the basic, sort of easy aspects of actually just managing, like being in the CEO position, so to
mhm,
speak. And yeah, that's sort of the hardest part. I think there's a lot of things out there now, like to set up the business and hire people. Like I think there's a lot of infrastructure, but I think it's preparing yourself for the journey and the role that you're in that you haven't done before in a new space. Like that is something that I didn't necessarily appreciate was going
mhm.
to be the hardest.
I think it's one of those things. It's like the classic. I mean, TV trope always does this. It's like when you're a kid, you always complain to your parents, like, "Oh, I want this, I want that. Why are things done like this?" And then you have your own house. You're like, "I have to take out the trash. I have an office. I have to bring the snacks. I have to do this. Oh, there's no one. Like I'm the only one who's reliable for those things." And it's those small things that, expect no matter how close you are to leadership, you just never consider before. You're like, oh, payroll's paid, and you're like, wait, I have to do payroll. What software? It's just every little thing becomes it's up to you, and it's one of those things where until you're in that seat, you just don't know about all the small things that have to be kind of put in order, even if they're not hard technically, just something that's your responsibility.
And I think it is that EQ, those
Mhm,
like it's those soft skills that I think is where it's almost the easiest to change, but in the moment, the hardest to focus on because, whether in a stressful startup you can let the passion and the excitement sometimes get in the way of delivery, and so it becomes very easy to say, well, it's right, it's just about the delivery, or it's about the how you go about it. But then when you're in that moment and it's happening, yeah, to your it's I don't have the time for that. I can come back. Like I'm just trying to get my point across, and I'm frustrated. And it's not about phrasing it nicely. I have a million things going on, and so yeah, it's those uh, yeah, those little things that I think are sort of first to go, but are important to manage, but are just hard to focus on in the context of real, seemingly massive problems in the
mhm.
moment.
It's like the small things make up the culture as well, where it's like, okay, how do you deal with all these small tasks? Because there's always stuff to do. Prioritizing becomes a bigger thing as well. And then I guess the classic trope is like once it's your company, it's kind of like your life. There's no stepping away from it. And that kind of ties into another point, especially within the mental health space. The I This is like not hotly contested, but like work life balance. Some say that there's no such thing. It's more work life synergy. Others use the more traditional term, like, hey, I'll try, 2 hours a night, I try to log off. Obviously, in the mental health space, being more conscious of it as burnout and really just trying to live a healthier life within a pretty hectic startup world. How do you manage that work life balance, or how do you interpret work life balance, especially in the early days when everything is up to you and there's so much to do that there's time is a limiting factor?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and I think it's something that I'm constantly evolving on as the business is entering different stages, and I'm trying to assess how I need to, find that new normal,
Mhm,
with the only constant of change. And what I'd say is that I don't think there's a right answer to work-life balance. I think people, find that for themselves. But what I'd say is, I think it's circumstantial for the role and for the business.
hmm,
I think if you're going to join a startup that is, being bootstrapped in a way that is sustainable and taking a measured approach, then you might be able to find that balance and expectation. But when in some of the, I don't know if it's the pressure from investors, or the nature of, the VC space. But when you try to have that high growth, value creation, sort of grow at all costs type of mentality, and be the outlier in terms of returns, you naturally have to ramp up the pressure. And so the way I look at it as, there's certain roles where I need that ownership mentality to be attached to that role. And if they can manage the time very well, so then balance is not an issue, then it's not an issue. But there's going to be times where, and I've been sitting, Travis Kelsey didn't go to the Grammys because it was
Mhm.
the Super Bowl the following week. And, when you raise, one seed round, when you launch your first biggest client, when you have those moments, you expect your key players to be there for you in the business. And I think that I expect, but then the rest of the business, it's not, they don't have, it's not required of everyone, and it's not healthy to create that, nor is it sustainable. So it's really about making sure that you are managing expectations such that people can have the work-life balance that's needed across the rest of the organization.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's the thing is like there's some times when, hey, you're gonna have to work 7 days a week, crazy hours. But the idea is how can you almost like anything in life, like there's peaks and valleys, and how can you balance it out so that over multiple years you're successful? I think that's one thing you touched on is the problem is, if you have like if you're in a market that, for example, like crypto over the net last week, you need to launch, raise money because this is your only time now, and it's crazy. But I feel it's almost the Canadian mindset, especially when I talk to Canadian founders and the Canadian finance system, where it's like, okay, over 10 years, how do you have success? And working really hard for 1 year, then being burned out for 5 is not the case. Now, you have to work hard for all these years, but it's figuring out how can you have the optimal output over the longest period of time. I think that's the thing. And like anyone, like you said, everyone kind of finds their balance. I speak to a lot of people that they don't like the idea of work life balance because there is no balance. But what they say, and this is, I guess, it's like semantics. They say is like going to the gym, eating healthy. That is a part of my work. I'm the CEO. I have to be healthy. If I'm not healthy, I'm useless. So getting good night's sleep, spending some social time with my family, especially if I have children, that's a part of my job. I just have to make sure I'm being as effective as possible, not wasting time on ineffective tasks. So I guess it's like you said, it's really finding a perfect balance. And again, being have a holistic, healthy thing because businesses take a long time. Many successful people, it's very rare I've ever met a very successful person who's like, yeah, I just last year came up with an idea and now I'm worth $1 billion. It's always like, well, 30 years ago I started this and then from there I moved here. It's always this long, interesting journey. But like as you're very aware, people only see success in a short period, not realizing that there might be 10 years of before to get you to that point. I think that's where you need that
Well, in
consistency over
that
long periods of
journey,
time.
I wanted to,
Mhm.
because it's that journey that makes it such that like there should be more sort of an open mind about what work-life balance can mean, in the sense that if you find that there isn't work-life balance, it doesn't, you can make that change and have a relationship with the business that's then healthy. But I think there's sort of the need to make everything work and to have it all that people have, where you start to become a little bit dissolute, like, or not disillusioned, but you're not rooted in reality. And I had a boss that used to say that theory is always right in theory, but not in reality. And I think that's true. And so in theory you can do all those things, but you can't do them in reality. And so you have to start prioritizing and being honest with what you can get from it and what you want. And I'm turning 30 this year. I'm in a period of my life where I'm seeing people across so many spectrums, and I truly find myself so focused on the business that I'm never one to care about age, but it's more that it's just having me think about what are those things that I want and what is important, and to make sure that I find the time to prioritize that, um, so I'm
Mhm.
not a passenger and then unhappy down the line, or neglecting what matters, and
Mhm.
letting everything crumble, so to speak.
Yeah, I think it's the idea is I've talked to obviously many founders throughout the years, and it's one of those things where you have to enjoy the journey because the journey is so long. And like anything in life, when you say, okay, once I hit this, I'll then be happier. Give me 5, and then in 5 years, then I'll start being happy. In the cases by that time, there's always something else. So it's obviously it's hard. There's a lot of hard things, but you have to have some enjoyment, or else, as someone said, what's the point? Like if you're always miserable and you have a lot of money, but you're still miserable. Why did you no, even if it's obviously monetary is nice, but like if you're your own, for your time, you can control your own schedule. If you're not taking advantage of that or at least enjoying it, what is the point? I think that's one of the things I spoke to founders, especially after like the first few years when they're like, okay, why am I doing this? What's the output? Like you said, like really writing down a list of goals. Like, what do I want out of this? What are my expectations, and how do I get there? Not just kind of aimlessly traveling through life. Because yeah, I turned 30 as well, and like, it's really interesting at being this age where it's like some people have 3 kids, have a family. Others
Yeah.
are like, you know what? I might start looking at careers now. Like, I've done the more part time gigs. Now I'm looking for a real job. And you have other people who are like, I'm gonna go back to school. It's like everyone's doing different things in their life, so it's really dependent on who you compare it to. But you start thinking about like, okay, 10 years I'm 40, and then and then you just start going on and on. But obviously, you've had obviously some career success throughout this whole journey, kind of where you got to today. How obviously being a founder is like a big part of an identity as well. How do you feel that affects your identity? Obviously, like having success in your career, and maybe others who may have worked with before moving on to different roles, how do you kind of focus on yourself with like, okay, is being a founder a big part of my identity? How do I feel about like have you found that change your mindset at all? Or is it just work and you can kind of separate it? It's maybe a little weird, vague question though.
No, no, no. It's a fair. It's. I guess I'll answer it personally in that I'm someone that is extremely passionate about what I'm passionate about, and I would struggle to get through the first page of something that I'm not interested in.
Mm,
And so for me, it's not so much about oh, it's work and it's this, because it's not really about whether it's an entrepreneur or
mhm,
it's this or it's that. It's what am I doing in that moment? And
mm,
so for me, it's really nothing to do about my role as an entrepreneur, because what I'm doing day to like month to month, day to day, it's changing all the time, and the needs of that role are constantly changing. It's that I find that my identity is rooted much more in the cause and the
mm,
mission, but especially because it's healthcare, especially because it's a pediatric thing, and especially because it's personal to me. And so I find that mental health has always been a part of my journey, because it is part of my identity. Sorry,
mhm,
because when I was the first of any of my parents, you know, anyone they knew to send their
mhm,
kid to therapy, because I was young and they didn't know what to do, and now it's such a common thing, and I had to normalize it because it wasn't normal and it wasn't accepted, or there wasn't awareness. And I'd say that now, actually being a founder in the mental health space, and especially with that sort of
mhm,
pediatric lens that my therapist came to me with, I find that the business is naturally connected to my founding story, my identity, and my life and identity is
mhm,
naturally tied to the mission of the business. So there is that overlap in a big way, but it's not really about like work
mhm.
or the role. It's the cause and the mission. And I
That
should say,
mhm,
to connect it even to the last point we were making around making it worth it, I think that's especially then true for people that are doing healthcare, and some where it's highly regulated and more expensive in many cases to build and scale. It is harder to get, I mean, do
mhm,
a lot of things to actually scale it, and it takes a lot more work. And you have to really make sure that you're enjoying it and that it's meaningful, because um, you can make money faster and it might not take as long in terms of the life cycle of the
mhm,
business, or at least your return on it in other industries. And so I think to do something like this, you really have to be passionate and connected to it
mhm.
and love it. And so it naturally is connected to me.
Yeah, I think that's the big thing is if you have passion, it's finding passion. Because I think it becomes. I know many founders it becomes hard when you're like back in the day, especially you were raising in early days. Like, oh, I raised 5 million. My friend rose 7, and then there's always someone who's more a little bit younger, more successful. And I had someone say they were like, oh, like this career you make so much more money, and then you sit down, you're like, but do I want to like? For me, it's like my siblings want to be lawyers. I'm like, wow, you can make so much money being a lawyer. I'm like, but I hate reading legal. I do a lot of legals. I hate it. I don't want that as like in my head. I'm like, oh, it's so great, but I don't want to do the work or do it. So I'm like, okay, so think back, like, do I really want to do that? Even if the money was 10x, would I be happy? And sometimes you realize, no, I'm just there's always the grass is greener when you don't, realize the work. And like law, especially a lot of reading. If you don't like a lot of reading, especially boring books, not for you. And I think that's one of the big things, like you said, it's with the founding journey, right? It's any work having some passion where it's or some level of enjoyment where it's more than just a job. It's like mentally stimulating. You feel like you're making an impact. I think that's the biggest thing. Also to prevent burnout as well. And I found that's the key. If you like your work, burnout is much the higher threshold than if it was something you just were miserable doing from day one.
And then when you're
Mhm,
severe ADHD, it then becomes that, like, that is literally what it's the inability to focus on things you don't care
mhm,
about. And so it then becomes you have to trust your gut and live your life by that, because you're always going to be fitting a square peg in a
mhm,
round hole if you're not aware and making the decisions that align with that passion. And even if it's a great opportunity with lots of money, like the golden handcuffs, it doesn't work if if you can't sit still and you're required to sit
mhm,
still. And it's just that
mhm,
simple. And not that you can't sit, there's ways to
mhm.
manage it, but you know what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
I think it's also a thing, and you touched on a bit, is that like over a lifetime, typically people you consider be very successful have that passion or whatever it is. There is something passionate about it because it's a long journey, and you have to have something more that really keeps you engaged, even in those rough times where maybe the economy's not strong or X, Y, and Z. So obviously, a lot of passion in healthcare, and especially with childhood mental health when growing this business, obviously, like you said, like children's therapy is, I won't say a newer thing, but not normalized, especially when you're coming up with this or working through this. Were there a lot of people maybe within the space who were not fully aware of like childhood therapy? Why are we sending kids to therapy? Would you have to fight some of that stigma in the early days, or because it's so popular, especially within the space, people understood the importance of it, or was there always some that dissonance where they're like, I don't want to send my kids there. That's not for like, was that some of the weird things you had to deal with in the early days?
Yeah, so it's a great question. What I'd say is it's funny because when I was like in my first sort of
Mhm,
business, that was a digital
mhm,
health, a digital mental health platform, and it was the first at that time. It really was about the awareness of the extent of the problem.
mhm,
Where now, and especially related to kids, it's total awareness that there is a crisis and a problem, but it's a question about, like, what is, like, your solution, and why is your solution actually solving this problem, because it is such a big problem and people look at it from so many different perspectives. So I think for us it's really connecting the dots to how PlaySpace, and virtual engagement is the missing piece in the access and effectiveness like problem
mhm,
that is the root of the child mental health crisis. Because in child therapy, therapeutic alliance is the first and leading indicator of therapeutic success. And therapeutic alliance is the measure of the relationship and that rapport between a child or a teen or any patient and their
mhm,
therapist. And so engaging the child is how you build that alliance. It's not that you can stuff a protocol or structured treatment, you know, down a child's throat in the way that would allow them to actually take it in and then have it be a benefit. They need to be able to comprehend it and listen and take the advice in the way that they're, best to receive it. And it's the therapist's job to find ways to apply it and use different techniques. And so I say that because, like, that is people aren't necessarily aware then of what that means. And I say, we're not trying to validate that, let's say, you know Uno is more effective than Monopoly in
mhm,
getting outcomes, because that's not the point. The point is, the minute a therapist goes from a clinic playroom, to a video conferencing tool, there is neither of those things. And that's the problem. And simply adding those games doesn't work because it's not secure. There's all these considerations around, controls, personalization, like all the therapeutic angles. And so we are, I think, now really we were really trying to convince people early on that tic tac toe plus video is what increases access because 80% of US counties don't have a regulated child mental health professional. So we're not going to move people from, New York City to rural Idaho to solve the problem. We are going to have people available online and virtually to make it accessible. But if they're not confident to do so, they're never going to get there. And so we needed to convince people early on that this was the right path to the end, but not that the end was a meaningful path, worth any
Mhm.
effort.
Yeah, it's like you said, theories are great in theory, and especially with a lot of, you know, anything within therapy, it's like clinically this might be the best process, but if the child or the person just isn't comprehending, doesn't want to be a part of it, it's useless. So it's like, how do you make that deeper connection? Um, is the key here. Have you found that one thing's interesting? Obviously, being digital, it's a lot easier for accessibility. One thing early days, especially my my time in digital mental health as well, was that there was a people felt, especially in the older generation, oh, I don't want to do it online. No one likes to use Zoom. It's not, I'm an in-person type person. Studies show that's not true. People very much enjoyed online digital therapy. But have you found that that pushback wasn't as big of a deal for younger generation or children because they kind of grew up with the technology and they're kind of more ingrained with it? Or have you found that it was still the same thing where people were hesitant maybe to focus on digital in the early days?
Well, and this is what's so interesting. It's children, especially in studies have widely published that children are actually very open to doing therapy online and believe it can be done effectively, and there's no issue until they've done it. And then when they've done it, they've had a poor experience, and because they've only had, a video conferencing tool, and you have a therapist holding up tic-tac-toe on pieces of paper or trying to send links and share
Mhm,
screens, and it's terrible. And so there's that. Then you have the therapists who are scarred from having to do it during COVID, where
mhm,
it was a total nightmare and reactionary, and they're so happy to be back. And as much as they would love to have the convenience of something that's virtual, the loss of the practical tools is their biggest reason for not doing so. And then the last thing is then parents are, have a hangover from Zoom school, where that there's no way, like, that did not work. There's no way that this is then going to work for a therapeutic
mhm,
context. And this is so important. So it was a lot of initial pushback because most most therapy sessions for adults and are delivered virtually. Like, that
mhm,
is where we've gotten to. Pre-pandemic, like 2019, United
mhm,
Health report, 99% office space. Now, approximately 55% of all sessions are done virtually. But with children, it virtually all went back to in person after, because the
interesting.
therapists
Mhm,
didn't feel they could be effective, and parents didn't want that either. And so what's happened is we had a bad solution to an important problem, which then has now reinforced our bad behavior, and now we're creating now, like, a terrible precedent, and it needs to be solved. And when you create now a good experience to
mhm,
override now that bad experience and to negate that, like, that is how we get progress on the whole. So now we're starting to scale with, some of the largest, companies and providers of mental health care, in North America and in other geographies as well. And they're seeing the impact this can have for a number of reasons. And we can get into
mhm,
that, but it's interesting because there's so many use cases and there's so many applications. It's really just about getting them to understand that, uh, this is worthwhile and that they're going to have that support, because technology, as much as kids are very familiar, most therapists are not. And therapists were learned, like, all went to school and for a long time to practice and learn a specific way. And so to automatically change because, I have studies that say this works, and, we've built it for them, it takes a little bit of trust. And our goal is to be that trusted partner to therapists and organizations that want to support their child
mhm.
therapists.
It's like it reminds me of that thing where it's like the problem was real and there had to be a better way of doing digital, but the solution just wasn't there yet. It's like, I mean, we talked about you just got the iPad recently, is that like Microsoft invented the first touchscreen tablet, but it was just too early. The apps didn't work, but like the idea was there, but again, people who used it were like, "Oh, this is not that great." But then it's that re-education of like, "Hey, the problem we're trying to solve is a real problem. The solution just wasn't there." And obviously with PlaySpace, you're like, "We need to go digital. This works, but we have the solution that was like that missing piece that didn't allow, you know, walk so you could run. There was a missing piece that didn't allow that to be the success as it should have been with the tools that you were developing." So I think it's one of those things
But to
where
be
it's
clear,
like,
it's the start of
yeah.
a revolution across the board because it wasn't
Mhm,
just this, like, this is our use case, and this is an important problem that I'm wanting to solve personally. But it's the start of a broader conversation. And that's why I say a revolution
mhm,
around you can't take one solution, you can't take one product or one answer to solve every single patient.
mhm,
And we said, oh, video is now going to be used to solve every problem across every type of customer who engage with technology or different types of services or across different condition types and areas of care where they require different
mhm,
levels and considerations around engagement. And so it was a completely, it, we had to react and we had to try our best, and there was a lot of things to go on. So it's not that, there was bad intentions here, but the recoil to revert back and the hardening in the
mhm,
previous, like,
mhm,
you know suboptimal complacent behavior, like, is not the answer. And now we're starting to at least see the buy-in from large organizations, from therapists, especially around children, because there's a sensitivity there, and we're hoping that that lends to other areas of accessibility, whether it's uh, ages,
mhm,
whether it's gender, whether it's upbringings, whether it's cultural, whether like whether it's racial. There's so many aspects that impact how you engage with care, because care is so personal, and we really need to be thoughtful of how each of these people engage, because one is not going to work for all, and you can't accommodate all at once. And I get that, but it has to be sometime, and
mhm.
that should start now.
Yeah, it's always the challenge of like, developing a solution while also having a targeted market. Like, okay, this works, but like really focusing on who can get the most benefit of it and building it for the people you're trying to serve. I think that was one of the big challenges with. I mean, my wife's a school teacher, and so like Zoom class, it was like they found that actually for like older students from her experience, like grade 11s and 12, they get part-time jobs and do school and actually prepare them a lot for university where there was that independence. So you had kids now who could pay for their tuition before going to university. Then she also had kids in grade one where it was just, the kid, it was a mess, iPads everywhere. Half the kids were walking around showing them their pet cat, pet dog, and they're like, this was a mess. So it's one of those things where the solution for some was phenomenal, but it's when it's a 4-year-old to an 18-year-old, there's just too much breadth and difference for one solution for all, especially for online schooling, from my experience. So I think that's one of the things very well that you touched on is that developing the right solution for the right people that really solves the right need.
And when you get
Through mhm,
warm, then you're warmer and warmer,
yeah.
and then you can keep building on that. And I say that because, it's not that, like, it's all you're gonna get it right on the first go. It gives you the opportunity to build it out. And for us, even now, it started with solving that virtual problem, but now we actually have so many therapists that are bringing some of the tools that we've created, because they're better than the physical equivalents, and they're bringing those to in-person sessions. And so now it's being used in totally different ways, and expanding the value proposition that we initially idealized for it. And it's those opportunities now to have greater impact, and wider impact that you thought of, that until you start even implementing within your core area, you don't have the opportunity to even really explore or identify.
And that's so true. It's one of those things like a stepping stones on the ladder, progressively getting to a better and better solution. And it's, I mean, like you said, bring the tools back into the space. So having that virtual environment, we saw the growth of the Apple Vision, where it's okay, augmented reality, things that before were very clunky. I used to have the first Oculus, now are becoming more and more user acceptable, and we've seen a lot of success within that virtual reality or at least augmented reality within especially healthcare system, allowing for things that have never been done before in greater success. But again, the first few were pretty rough 10 years ago, but now we're getting to a better and better solution because it takes those incremental steps to solve these problems as they adapt and change. Have you found, obviously, with this, like, I know we touched on this a little bit, but like with this augmented reality and AR, have you found that being a big space for allowing for better access to health for children therapy, especially because there's so much more you can do in the virtual space rather than maybe the like Earth space? That's kind of weird now that we're getting to these techie words because it's not
In
virtual, it's in
person,
person.
yeah,
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 in person, digital. Yeah.
yeah. So the answer is the opportunity. Absolutely. It's undeniable. And do I believe it's the future, or at least this is a part of? Absolutely. But again, this goes back to the point of like, as a CEO, like I need to build a business that if that is either going to deliver revenues in the near term, or I'm going to have funding to support the long
Mhm,
grind to get those long term revenues. And the reality is that with VR and AR, like there's so many problems with scaling that, and the mass adoption of both the hardware and what's
mhm,
required for the software, that when we're trying to solve access problems, for example, for children's mental health, people in these like let's say in rural areas, and
mhm,
we're working in rural areas in underserved and vulnerable communities, even if we had the best VR headset like Apple's, like we wouldn't be able to optimize it for its features because we're dealing with lower bandwidth, and we're dealing with and so it's and nor are they equipped to like learn all that is required to take full advantage of these things in that moment. And so for us, for example, and this is where it almost seems counterintuitive, but it's what we're doing. We're actually launching VR for in-person sessions. So we have right now what is the best digital sand tray, like therapeutic sand tray on the market, and we have therapists that are saying we don't want to do sand tray play anymore because you can't sanitize the sand tray. It's you
mhm,
can't save it. There's limitations. It's small. Now with your virtual equivalent, there's so much more we could do, and we're using it in person. And so we asked, like, what are the next ways to take it? And so by saying, hey, now we're going to bring VR to the session, now you don't need the patient and the provider to have it. There's no troubleshooting with the parent with the child who might not be able to set it up
mhm,
themselves. And you're now expanding not the limitations of a virtual environment that naturally can be
mhm,
limitless, but you're actually expanding the limitations of a physical environment which was limited by adding sort of that virtual layer to it. And so for us, we're thinking of how can we apply meaningful solutions along the adoption curve, and such that the impact is not just hopeful and based on merit, but actually realized alongside its execution.
mhm. Yeah, and it's such an amazing thing, especially being able to bring in that, like you said, solving the problem, starting with in-person sessions where it's a little bit easier to scale, much more control, easier environment to set up, and rather than setting these units everywhere. I think that's one of the things where it's. I guess as we are almost wrapping up here, and this kind of brought another question to my mind, especially talking about passion and like opportunity. As a founder, how do you balance between like realistic ways to generate revenue and like this futuristic dream you want and balancing those things? Because obviously, like you said, like there's a passion here, but there's also a limitation on technology and what's possible to some extent. So how do you balance between like trying to build something extremely revolutionary at the same time of trying to generate things that can still make revenue in the middle to short term? Because 20 years from now is great, but that's a long runway. So how do you kind of balance that, especially as a founder where you can almost make any decision you want? You can try anything you want. How do you balance all these options out there when technology is moving so fast and there's so much opportunity, but there's only a small team, you and your team, who can do these things?
Um, I don't know if there's a right answer, but to me, what I do is I try to identify the constants and the variables, and I'm someone that's always open-minded and curious, but trying to make sure that there's some foundation or
Mhm,
context to which the curiosity, can bet at least
mhm,
be meaningfully benefit.
Mm.
And so for us, it's about constantly changing and being open to that change and assessing what are these meaningful opportunities, while also recognizing that, it's not about what's exciting, it's not about trying to get there tomorrow. It's recognizing that we have to find this balance. And so I look to everyone on my team, and I have an incredible team. They were with me in my last company. They were immediately part of this company. They're directly connected to the cause. They're amazing, and they're the counterpart to be able to think these things through and make sure that what we're working on is always sort of the highest value piece. And if that means that we have to make radical changes and on a constant basis to do that, that's fine. But always knowing what are the constants and what are the variables, and reassessing that is what I do.
Mhm. And I think that makes a lot of sense because there's always that without a team, or at least a team that you can trust to give you honest feedback, it becomes very easy to almost get run away with these dreams, especially with AI. You're like, okay, we use ChatGPT and this vision, and all of a sudden you're making an AI health company, which is completely different than the core mission and vision you had. And I think that's the big thing with being a founder is sure, it's good to be creative, but okay, how, like you said, where is this root cause? How are we, bettering the mission we started with? Because it can get your mind can start wandering very quickly, and you're not adding value a lot of those times when you start getting into everything's AI based when there's no need to be AI
Well, also, I
at
should
the
say
time.
I'm also not a product founder. I'm
Mhm.
a business founder, and so I actually think there's a almost a level of like what you don't know allows you to think
Mm.
in an unbounded way, or it maybe get parsed through more over time because I don't go as deep, because I see some cool announcements around the Vision Pro, and I think of all the cool
Mhm.
opportunities in theory. When I've already done a Quest integration, and
Mhm.
we've you doing that, and maybe they're the exact same thing, and I don't know. And of course, I've done my
Mhm.
research now, and I do know some of those answers. But the point is that I can start throwing things at my team, knowing that I can trust them. And there's times, of course, that you have to check yourself and learn, and can't blindly trust anyone. But that's why you have a lot of a team, so there aren't those faults in it where I can bring some of those ideas and other people can bring those ideas, but that they get filtered through in a way where they don't become distractions,
Mhm.
and they're appropriately considered.
For sure. And as we're wrapping up here, if people want to follow more across your journey, learn more about you or the business, kind of what's the best way to learn more about PlaySpace and especially the innovation you're creating every day?
Yeah, so go to LinkedIn and follow PlaySpace, or on Instagram or TikTok or YouTube, playspace.health, and follow along. We're going to be posting case studies of how it's benefiting therapists and their patients, as well as some cool announcements and activities. So, particularly if you're a therapist, I should say, working with children or adolescents, please reach out. We'd love to be able to support you however we can, so that you can treat your patients where they are